Okay. I'm here today for a press conference, which is being presented by a combination of the National Space Society and the Space Frontier Foundation. Our two organizations are working together to present this press conference because of the importance of the topic at hand. And this concerns what I've got up here, which is a short version of the title of the study, Evolvable Lunar Architecture Study. I'm Mark Hopkins. I'm the moderator for this event, and I'm also the CEO of the National Space Society. This here gives the plan for today. At the top, we have the actual full title for the report. It's the Economic Assessment and Systems Analysis of an Evolvable Lunar Architecture that leverages commercial space capabilities and public-private partnerships. You can see why I had a short version on the first slide. And here's the people that will be speaking. In a minute, will say something about the National Space Society. And then the next speaker will be Gary Olson, and he's on the board of the Space Frontier Foundation. And he'll say something about that organization. And then we'll have the person who did most of the work, the principal investigator, Charles Miller. He'll come up and talk about the meat of the subject. And he's also president of NexGen Space, LLC, which is the company which did the project. And then we will have 4 additional people who will make comments, and they're quite an illustrious group, concerning the study, either by video in 2 cases, or they're here in person. After that, we'll have questions. So, let's talk about National Space Society. We are the premier activist grassroots organization which is in supporting the human spaceflight in the world. We were founded by Wernher von Braun in 1974. We have offices in Washington, D.C., although we're an international organization. We have a number of illustrious individuals which have been involved with our organization, one of which is Buzz Aldrin, who is former chair of our board of directors. Of course, he is second man who went to the moon. We also have, as one of our alumni executive directors, George Whitesides, who left us in 2009 to become the chief of staff at NASA. And currently, he is the CEO of Virgin Galactic. And of course, Lori Garver, who was a former executive director of the National Space Society. She was, up until recently, the deputy director of NASA, which is the number 2 position. Currently, she is the general manager at the Airline Pilots Association, which is the big international pilots union, has over 50,000 pilots in it. And with that, I wanted to just make one comment personally about the study. And here's my view. The most important thing is we can reduce the cost of returning to the moon by a factor of 10. That's an order of magnitude. This really changes everything. And I say that in part because of my background. I'm an economist by training. I have degrees in economics from the California Institute of Technology and also Harvard University. And so when I look at programs, I'm always sort of running mentally in my mind cost-benefit analysis. And if you drop the cost by a factor of 10, from a policy viewpoint, all of a sudden, you've increased the importance, you increased the benefits of doing this project by a factor of 10, and that's really big. With that, I'm going to introduce Gary Olson. He is the next speaker. He's a senior aerospace engineer at TASC. He's a board member of the Space Frontier Foundation, which is, well, he'll be up here in a sec, and also a former board member of my organization, National Space Society. Gary?
Thank you, Mark. So.
You had it on.
Oh, I did it. So I represent the Space Frontier Foundation, an organization of people dedicated to opening the space frontier to human settlement as rapidly as possible. I want to also thank the Heinlein Prize Trust, who helped sponsor this event. This study shows the possibility of dramatic cost reductions for deep space missions. Beyond that, it demonstrates that public-private partnerships can lead to economic growth that is increasingly self-supporting. It challenges any notion we may have that space commerce must lag far behind exploration as we move out into the solar system. Rather, commerce is an equal partner to exploration. Commerce must ultimately take the lead for us to incorporate the solar system in our economic sphere, as John Martberger once put it. Commerce, empowered by free enterprise, is key to leading human civilization into space. Only commerce can drive a thriving space economy that will enable and require human settlement. Now and forever, the most valuable thing in space is people. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Charles Miller. He is the principal investigator of the project, and as I said earlier, this will be the meat of what we're talking about. He's also president of NexGen Space LLC. He's executive coordinator of the Alliance for Space Development, which is an alliance between the National Space Foundation and the Space Frontier Foundation for legislative purposes, and also has 10 other organizations involved in it as well. He's co-founder of NanoRacks, which is a corporation which is currently putting experiments on the space station. He's formerly NASA's senior advisor for commercial space. He's also former board member of the National Space Society. Charles?
Thanks, Mark. First, I want to thank the Space Frontier Foundation and the National Space Society for sponsoring this press event of this study that was funded by NASA. So I also want to thank NASA for their financial support for doing all the work we did. We couldn't have done it without them. We put in a proposal last summer, which was in a competitive proposal. There was 5 winners in the Office of Chief Technologist, and we were funded at $100,000. So this is a initial study about the feasibility of returning to the moon. Let's see here. So, is this, okay. So, top level view. So we basically say the results of this study that with a step-by-step incremental fashion, leveraging commercial partnerships that you can return to the moon. It's technically feasible. So, and the context of this is NASA's made 3 major attempts to get approval to go back to Moon and onto the Mars in the last 45 years since Apollo, and every one of them has basically been turned down by our elected leaders, both Congress and the White House. And they failed because the minimum cost was $100 billion, and the price grew from there to many hundreds of billions to, in one case, almost $1 trillion. And it was just a non-starter. So the base of this study was leveraging the now lessons learned from COTS and Commercial Crew. Could you go back to the moon? Is it technically feasible, and what would it cost? That's the core questions of this study. And so that's what we were looking at. We put together a team, NexGen put together a team of all former NASA, very experienced former NASA people who work in these areas. I was the principal investigator, NASA senior advisor for commercial space. In the back of the room is Dr. Alan Wilhite. He's the co-principal investigator. He led the technical analysis. He set up the systems analysis branch at Langley that now leads NASA's studies of these types of systems of deep space human spaceflight. And he was head of program assessment for Dan Golden. And then for the last 15 years, he's been training grad students and PhD students in how you do this type of analysis. So he led this. I also want to mention the support of Edgar Zapata from Kennedy, who is a life cycle cost expert. He's at Kennedy, so we received generous support on really hard data on how the life cycle costs. And I want to mention David Chevron here, who was 37 years in safety and mission assurance, including 19 years at NASA JSC. So he's an expert on human spaceflight safety and mission assurance. So we used all that, and several other people that you have in your press packets or on the thumb drives. The media had all this information there. We also took the extra step. We set up an independent review team. of these people, all a bunch of former senior NASA people, human spaceflight people, 4 former astronauts, space policy professionals. We did a day-long independent review in March. We were asking them, are we missing anything? What are we missing? Any showstoppers? Tell us, what's wrong with our approach. We got some great feedback. We incorporated it, and many of the stuff in the final report. There's a 100-page final report. It's gone online. You'll get the URL at the end, but it's available. So this team, the core team I showed in the previous slide, and this independent review team, the expertise that they have all shows up in this. And 2 members of the independent review team are sitting at the table at the far end. Hoyt Davidson, he led the economic sub-team looking at the economic analysis. And Tom Moser, he was critical on the technical review team, and they'll be providing the views, the independent review team. And we'll also have a video from Chris Kraft, the founder of NASA Mission Control, and NASA JSC director, center director for 10 years, we have a video of him providing his views. His health did not permit him to be here. What is an evolvable lunar architecture? So this is what we study. We broke it up in 3 phases. We made it as technically easy in phase 1, no new technology to the maximum extent possible in phase 1 to human sorties to the moon. Then with your lunar lander that you can put down at the poles, you use propellant, you develop and prove propellant transfer in parallel. When that's ready, you go into phase 2, you put the same lunar lander at the poles, humans at the poles. And in parallel with this, you're doing robotics prospectors to the poles to find out where the best water is, how much it is, how deep it is, because you want to pick the best polar crater. It's location, location, location. Real estate value matters. And then in parallel with that, you're developing the technology you need for in situ resource utilization. That means using the resources of the moon. When that's ready and the technology is ready to use it, you're enabled to go into phase 3, which allows a reusable lunar lander, which dramatically changes the economics, and our research shows that you can have a permanent lunar base all within a very constrained fixed budget. We leveraged to the maximum extent possible existing systems, Earth orbit rendezvous and propellant transfer, and so it's a step-by-step steady progress of using existing commercial systems. The summary of the study conclusions. It's technically feasible. The conclusion of the study is technically feasible to leverage commercial systems to return to the moon 5 to 7 years from authority to proceed. And the total cost of that we estimate for 2 providers is $10 billion. All our cost data is anchored on the commercial crew and commercial ISS cargo, so we can't cost estimate a single provider because both of those were under the situation of competition. So we actually have much more fidelity, assuming competition. It'd be about $10 billion, about $5 billion each, plus or minus 30%. So there's some uncertainty in here. We believe that the next president who comes in, if they started this, could have, by the end of their second term, have humans return to the moon. And the cost of duplicating Apollo is about $12 billion. The first footsteps and basically 6 missions. Apollo today is about $140 billion in current dollars, so that's about an order of magnitude reduction. This enables a permanent lunar base by phase 3. So we looked at 2 human missions a year with 6-month terms, 4 astronauts offset, 4 cargo delivery missions, 1 every 3 months. You can do this all within a fixed $2.8 billion budget. Takes you about 10 years, 12 years from the first footsteps, about that, to get to step by step to a permanent lunar base that's producing 200 metric tons of propellant. It's got a very economic focus, 200 metric tons of propellant in lunar orbit to enable NASA to have affordable missions to Mars. That is a key strategic goal. So total estimated cost of that is about $40 billion. This all assumes a new partnership in the later phases for an international lunar authority or something like that. And our analysis suggests this is a very effective way to make the partnerships even better. And there's a lot of detail in the full report on this. Implications for NASA going to Mars. A commercial lunar base would make much more affordable to go to Mars. Propellant is 80% of the mass that under all 100% Earth-based approaches. If you can get your propellant already there for you at low cost, it radically lowers the cost of Mars and the technical complexity. So, for example, our current approach for sending humans to Mars, that NASA's baseline, it needs 10 to 12 launches of SLS. It's very risky and operationally complex to have that many missions. So you only need 3. It actually makes an SLS-based Mars approach much more technically affordable, technically feasible and affordable. So we think this actually works very well with the baseline SLS launch vehicle that NASA is developing. And we think it could substantially pay, since it's a commercial lunar base, all owned and operated by infrastructure, that could stand, NASA as a customer propellant would basically could substantially pay and potentially even 100% pay for the operation of the lunar base. It has implications for private and other government space travel. In phase 3, our analysis suggests that the cost of a trip to the moon to stay there for a week or 2 and come home on the surface of the moon is $150 to $200 million. Right now, Space Adventures has sold a couple seats to go a trip around the moon, just to look at the far side of the moon and come home for $150 million a seat. For that same price, so they're proving there's a market, that same price, you can visit the moon and stay there a week and then come home. And we also believe there's lots of other countries that the first citizen of Japan, Germany, France, Canada, there's going to be serious demand for U.S. commercial providers to take those citizens to the moon and do real work. Public benefits. There are significant public benefits on this, but now, as I think Mark made a very good point, the cost-benefit ratio goes up by an order of magnitude. I think the most significant is economic growth and national security. Economic growth, you're going to be driving, we already see proof of this, that these partnerships have significant economic growth. With the COTS ISS cargo delivery system, U.S. has recaptured a tie for world leadership in space launch. We had lost leadership in that, but now SpaceX last year had as many launches as Europe. And its significant benefits to national security the same. So if we do this, you're going to have much higher flight rates and lower reduction of costs of American launch and in-space infrastructure, and that has significant economic growth and national security benefits. Much more detail about this in the report. Top strategic risks I want to leave you with. We don't know exactly how much water is in the moon or how deep it is. We know there's water. We've proven it recently. We think that we don't know how plentiful it is and how deep it is. That is a key issue we need to understand, and as a strategic issue, that if there's one thing we should do soon is send a resource prospector to the moon. And so we recommend that. Summary of study conclusions. This is Joe Rothenberg, former head of human spaceflight, NASA human spaceflight, who could not be here. He had other commitments, but he left us with this quote that he congratulated us on an impressive study. But basically, he's saying there's much more work to be done. This wasn't a conclusive study in saying this is the way you have to do it and answered all the questions. It created a lot more questions that are useful. But what it did said, this could be much more economically affordable. I think it definitively answered that question, that using this approach you could afford to go to the moon. We're not saying this is the way you do it. There may be better ways. We're not saying that this is what you have to use it for. You could use this approach for other purposes. But from an economic research perspective, you could afford to go to the moon within NASA's existing budget. And finally, I just want to, this is in your charts, but for the people online, this is the URL at researchgate.net. You can go pull down the 100-page report, and that's it. Thank you.
And next on the agenda is a video from Christopher Kraft, generally referred to as Chris Kraft. He was the America's first spaceflight director, and you need to internalize what that means. The spaceflight director is the guy who's really in charge. He's God. He's really in charge down at Mission Control when there's a human spaceflight mission which is going on. So he makes the decisions, and the buck stops with him. He sort of invented the concept of NASA Mission Control. He was the flight director for all of the Mercury missions, and he personally trained all the flight directors for the Apollo missions. He eventually became the director at NASA's Johnson Space Flight Center. At one point, he was presented by the President of the United States the Outstanding Leadership Medal. At the time, President was John F. Kennedy. He was once on the cover of Time magazine. He really became a legend in his own time. And in 2011, the Johnson Space Center renamed its Mission Control Center the Christopher C. Kraft Jr. Mission Control Center in his honor. So let's have that video.
NexGen, which is a company owned by a friend of mine, was asked to do a study by NASA on ways to go commercially and probably with the government back to the moon, and primarily an economic study to see whether that was feasible. The study has been made. Their report is now about to be in your hands, and I think it's a very good one. It says that it can be done. It will take good management and good leadership on the part of both the aerospace industry and NASA. And hopefully, at the same time, we will be able to establish what I call an international program office, under which would be all the other nations in the world that want to join with NASA in going back to the moon at this point in time, which is what the study was carried out to do. The study has shown that you can do it within the NASA budget. Now that might take longer than people might want, but the study has shown that it can be done in about 7 years from start. I think that's very optimistic, but that's not a bad thing at this point in time. Now the game plan is based, mission plan if you will, is based on utilizing the resources of the moon as a source of both rocket fuel to be obtained from the water on the moon. And so that is one of the weak parts of the study, because we don't really know how much water is on the moon. If it's very little, then this study would not apply to what we want to do. We'd have to do it some other way. There are other ways. There have been studies made relative to the fuel depots, both in Earth orbit or around the moon, that would supply the same thing. A cost estimate for that kind of program would have to be done. I still think that's the right approach. Now, embodied in this study are a number of tools which also have been advocated for some time now. One is a reusable spacecraft to go to and from the moon to carry both equipment and eventually astronauts. And the other is a reusable lander which would go from lunar orbit to the surface. I think those are both great ideas, and I think you'll see that, how that would be done in this study. I'd like to point out that in the past, we have learned a lot of lessons from how to prepare, how to manage, how to build things in space. And I think those lessons, for some reason, in recent years have been unlearned, if you will, as a word. I think it's very important that we go back and look at how we did that. Why did we do Gemini? Why did we come about with the game plan that we needed to land on the moon. First time we started thinking about going to the moon after President Kennedy challenged this country was to two major approaches. One was to go from Earth orbit direct to land on the moon. The other was to just go direct to the moon, just as Jules Verne did. Now, what I want to point out is that was nonsense, because when you started trying to do those kind of things, you saw how impractical that was. That's the major point I want to make about having a game plan, having a mission plan, because it drives what you have to do. It drives the technology to do it. It drives the learning process you have to go through to make sure you can do it, and then do it safely, and then accomplish the task. And I think that's what's got to be done in the future, whether we're going to Mars, whether we're going back to the moon, or whatever the goal of these combined people in the world is. What SpaceX is doing, what Boeing is doing, what they're doing with the Dream Chaser eventually, those are good programs, and they've shown that you can come up with ways of reducing costs and still doing the job in space. I think it's going to take a lot more effort than we have presently done by flying them more often, et cetera, and that's what will make it safer. So the commercial approach, along with probably the help from the government and the management on top of that from both the commercial organizations and the government, will have to get together and see how we can do that a lot better than we've done it in the past to reduce the cost. You know, that's a challenge in the future, just like landing on the moon again will be. I think we've all recognized that eventually exploration of space is going to be more money than the United States is willing to invest by themselves. I think, therefore, both from an economic point of view, from a diplomatic point of view, and from a technology point of view, we're better off bringing the people from around the world into the space program that the United States is conducting. And we did that on the International Space Station, and I think it was extremely successful. It continues to be successful, and I think we will use it a great deal in days to come to perfect the programs that we've been talking about, and NASA's talking about, and what the other space cadets are talking about. And the problem we have there is management, and the problem we have there is how to bring all this together and plan it and lay it out from a schedule point of view, from a technology point of view, and from the point of view of who's going to do what. And I thought, so therefore you have to have what I term a international program office that would be made up of not only the United States, and they would take the lead, of course, but I think that they would bring in the people from the rest of the world who have the space desires and who have the space experience, and make them all part of the program, and they would be part of not only the hardware that is built in their countries, but it also in the total management and the conduct of the programs in the future.
Our next speaker will be Hoyt Davidson. He's our finance guy. He's the founding and managing partner of Near Earth LLC, a space investment bank and advisory firm. He's a member of the Commercial Space Committee of the NASA Advisory Council. He's had a 28-year career in investment banking. He's been an integral participant in providing over $15 billion in financing for various commercial space companies. And he's also vice president of my organization, the National Space Society. Hoyt?
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon. First, let me reiterate what Joe Rothenberg said about the Independent Review Committee. Our group, looking at the economic viability of the plan, found absolutely no showstoppers. There are certainly more things that need to be studied, more answers and issues that need to be addressed. But bottom line, we saw this as a very economic and doable business plan. One major of this effort was to make sure that evolvable also meant sustainable. This time we want to make sure humanity goes to stay, and that means the lunar architecture we choose has to be economically and politically sustainable for the long term and not just affordable and technologically feasible in the near term. To this goal, the ELA team came to 4 major conclusions. As Mr. Kraft just mentioned, we believe our return to the moon this time must be a broad international effort. Similar but perhaps even broader in participation than with the International Space Station. Space is hard and expensive. This will be a monumental achievement benefiting all mankind, and so the initial expense needs to be shared. That does not mean the U.S. cannot take a major or even a leading role. We hope it does. The important point is to establish an international governing body that all parties deem as fair and efficient. The study came up with a lunar authority concept in initial stages similar to something like CERN as a close analogy, and perhaps in the later days transitioning to something more like a port or airport authority, maintaining infrastructure and charging fees for use. Secondly, we found that this has to be a combined public-private effort involving numerous public-private partnerships with big established companies and small entrepreneurial corporations from around the world. This means the cost and risk of development is shared with industry. Perhaps more government up front and more industry as markets develop, but shared. A project to build a lunar base funded solely with government funding, even if broadly international, will not be sustainable. It would inevitably have a limited life, just like Apollo or the International Space Station. A sustainable architecture has to include a pathway to greater and greater private funding and therefore more control of specialized infrastructure and resources as new space markets develop, in particular the market for creating fuel from the water on the moon. Part of our success will depend on our ability to build competitive new industries that innovate and grow as these new markets evolve. Missions end. Industries innovate, evolve, and survive. Third, to increase the probability of success, we need to make baby steps as opposed to focusing on grandiose mission achievements. As Mr. Kraft said, this is how we got to the moon. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, even Apollo had flybys and robotic landers and orbiting before they tried to put boots on the ground. Baby steps will allow us to lower the investment risk at each step, allow each step to build upon prior successes, and avoid overly committing ourselves to any one technological direction. Innovation happens, sometimes quite rapidly. Political realities and funding availability changes, and new space markets are uncertain in their pace of development. So baby steps are a key to survival and sustainability. Lastly, the evolvable lunar architecture has to take into account the fact that a permanent lunar settlement should not be an end unto itself, but be itself a building block and baby step for our exploration and settlement of the rest of the solar system. The lunar architecture needs to include future human space goals into its planning, and this one does. For instance, the lunar settlement needs to enhance our ability to support further exploration and settlement of Mars and elsewhere. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Thomas Mosher. He served over 40 years in various NASA positions, and just to name a few of the many positions he's had, he's a former director of engineering at the Johnson Space Flight Center. He's a former NASA Deputy Associate Administrator for Human Spaceflight, and he was the first director of the first guy in charge of the space station project. Tom?
Thank you and good afternoon. I want to just acknowledge what you've heard from Dr. Kraft. He was more than a flight director. He was the father of mission control. He is the guy that's the oldest living pioneer of human spaceflight in the United States. He's starting this program before there was a NASA. He's still very active, as you can see. His mind, his work goes on endlessly in this. So it was an honor to be with him again and these other gentlemen in this program. President Kennedy said, and I'm going to review a little bit about why we have the foundation to do what's being proposed here in the architecture by ELA. President Kennedy said, we choose not to go to the moon because it's easy, but because it's difficult. Well, I think there's a little bit of update on that. I think, from my position, returning to the moon is easy, it's reasonable and affordable, and could be the pathway to Mars. In the Apollo program, we began that program, we didn't know what we didn't know. We had never put a human being in space when we started that. To do it, we had to do, there were a lot of challenges. We had to lift 6.4 million pounds from the Earth. We had to develop a crew transportation system to the moon. We had to have a landing vehicle on the moon. We didn't know how to navigate to the moon. We didn't know how to communicate to the moon. We didn't know how to organize to get there, but we did it because we had the will to do it. In the Mercury project, we didn't know if humans could even function. A lot of the medical community said people will die. They won't be able to black out when they get there. Mercury was nothing more than to put humans in space to see if, in fact, we could live there. Then we knew to get to the moon, as Dr. Kraft said, we had to rendezvous and dock in space. There was a program called Gemini. This is incremental. The whole purpose of Gemini was to see if two spacecraft could rendezvous and dock in space. That was the way to get there. We proved that that could happen. Then we developed the launch vehicle. Then we developed the lunar module to carry people down to the surface of Earth. The first spacecraft, true spacecraft ever built. It never lived in the atmosphere. Astronauts could put their finger through the sidewall in that spacecraft very easily. That's how lightweight it was. Then we got humans to the moon, and we did a lot of good work while we were there. Then to see if humans could stay long duration, not many people know about the Skylab program. People went up there and stayed for months at a time, proved that they could function and be useful in space. There's another part of our foundation. We said we need a transportation system, so we developed the most technologically complex thing that's ever been in space, the space shuttle. Apollo had huge technical problems. There were a few technical problems on the shuttle, and including one of them was the thermal protection system, where we had to put tiles all over the vehicle. In the space station, when I was fortunate enough to be the first program director on that, this was not a technological issue. This was simple, okay? Apollo was extremely hard technically. It was very simple politically. Everybody wanted us to do it, including the president and all the public. Space station, simple technically, a very difficult thing to do politically. So we're kind of bearing there again, how do we use all this foundation to do this? Well, NASA's working on something called the Space Launch System. That's a good program. How it plays into the program is an architectural element that needs to be decided, as along with the Orion spacecraft, which NASA's developing. But, and a big but, in parallel to that, and in all honor to them, the private sector is doing fantastic work. From Bigelow Aerospace looking at a hotel in space in livable volumes, SpaceX and Orbital Science sending goods to the space station, and on and on. Those are the things that Hoyt mentioned and that Charles Miller mentioned. That's the elements that we need to bring into the program. So we laid the foundation. We need the elements now of the private sector. We need the elements of international partners in a partnership way, like was mentioned, perhaps to get back to the moon. So today, the United States has developed the capability with the government and private sector to form partnerships and to possibly form an international authority to incrementally return to the moon and perhaps to Mars. The Evolvable launch architecture appears to be how to do it, not necessarily these way. The thing that is absolutely necessary, there has to be a will to do it. If there's not a will, it will not happen. Thank you.
Our last segment will be a video from Buzz Aldrin. Oh, he's on the phone? Yes. Okay, well, not yet, Buzz. I have to say something nice about you. Well, actually, I was going to say he doesn't need much of an intro. But look, 40 years ago, today. 46 years ago. Today. Yeah, this is government work, plus or minus. He piloted the first spaceship to land humans on the moon. There's not much more you can say than that, except I'll say one thing. He's also former chair of the board of directors of the National Space Society and currently serves on our board of governors. And with that, let's hear from Buzz. Buzz, now you can talk.
Buzz, you're on the line. You're on. Unmuted? No, she was never muted. You're on the phone. Hello?
Go ahead and talk, Buzz.
Okay. I wish I could say that I am just totally prepared for all of this. I think I am in content, but perhaps not in the polish and the backup numbers that you people have done so well. I wish that I could enlist a good bit of the support that I see evidenced by this. However, I think we need to look at a bigger picture and to see where all of the desires and elements fit into what we would like to do. And we've heard many times from different presidents that the ultimate objective is Mars. And I want you folks to know that that is my ultimate objective, and therefore it may be somewhat glossing over some of the very good work that you've done, because I just am not sure that we can afford to do those things that you've laid out and lay the groundwork that I feel is necessary to be able to get humans to Mars and to do it in a very sustaining way. In contrast to a design reference mission, which may have been excellent for the lunar program, taking humans from the surface of the Earth to the surface of the moon and back. We added a few things to it, like longer stay times, like rovers, much more complex experiments to be done. In some ways, we added EVAs on the way back, but we certainly had the opportunity of more than 2.5 hours. We were going 6-7 hours and several days of EVAs. It was a remarkable progress, and we're building on so much of that today. I would like to characterize not a design reference mission to go to the moon or a design reference missions that I've seen for going to Mars as primarily concentrating around one synodic period and then dispatching the various elements that are needed to support a crew landing during that time and supporting them and then bringing them back at the next opportunity. I believe that our ultimate objective is a building up of a settlement, colony, an accumulation of more and more people living permanently on the surface of Mars, and that has been my objective from the beginning. and I might characterize with a different approach than taking a particular time period and saying, what do we need to accomplish a particular goal at Mars or at the Moon? And I would call that a sequential. It could start today or any year, but a year-by-year progression of tasks, of objectives, of missions, up to a steady state condition, delivering humans to the planet Mars. So it is sequential, but it is evolutionary, building upon the things that we do early on, some in Earth orbit, then in Earth to Moon transportation, activities at the Moon, learning how to have a base designed for many users, landing that base and bringing it together, assembling it in a way that supports how we would assemble a base on Mars. This assembly technique can be demonstrated first on the big island of Hawaii. And the U.S. role is to, in my plan, is to assist in the overall modular designing the assembly from different landing locations with a rover that has a flatbed and a crane and brings these modules together, leveling them, and then interconnecting. So the transportation of bringing things together and the interconnects would be the U.S. role. The construction of the major modules would be international, following U.S. design. Those modules at the Moon I would call exploration module second generation. The first generation is an inflatable, and the third generation is the exploration modules for Mars. I have a few concise words written and gone over by myself, by my son, and I, of course, want to thank you, Charles, for giving all of us the opportunity of digesting the great work that you've put together, and for participating in various ways in the support of your study. For many years now, I've been a very strong supporter of commercialization of space activities, and I believe this study, looking at the commercialization of lunar activities, will take space commercialization to the next logical opportunity. And the work that you've done with NexGen Space on this study will accomplish moving to that next logical opportunity. I think the study supports the objectives of missions to Mars. I don't think we want to get caught in the gravity well of the Moon, except for commercial activities. NASA should focus its technology developing systems necessary for Mars that can be tested on the Moon. And we need to focus lunar development on bringing the international nations together and emphasizing the commercial activities, primarily the fuel and fuel depots that will be able to support the specific missions needed to get us to Mars. We'll need millions of pounds of propellant to support the permanent presence on Mars, and it should be a sufficient market to create a sustainable commercial propellant industry on the moon. My approach would start as early as 2018 with an inflatable. Stressing the international aspects, it would be at 42 degrees, the inclination of the Chinese orbit. In 2019, we can put an inflatable at L1. 2021 at L2. At some point, we would have developed the rigid modules, potentially a company like Alenia from Italy, who have done many pressure vessels for the space station. These modules would be first checked out with the inflatable in low Earth orbit, then at L1 and at L2. Refueling would be developed commercially, building upon commercial crew and cargo to the commercial station at 42 degrees, and then commercial crew and cargo to L1 and L2 with lifeboat remaining as at the space station for about 6 months, and then being relieved and coming back down again.
Buzz, could you wrap it up quickly? We have some deadlines here for the press that...
Yeah, okay, that's the usual case. My entire presentation is cycling pathways with intermediate exploration objectives leading to Occupy Mars, cycling spaceships that can take 3 landers every other synodic period, 6 people per lander. We'd have 6 people at Phobos, and they would land and then be replaced by 6 more, so we'd be landing 18 people every synodic period on Mars. There are many other ways of using the cyclers for inbound and outbound, and I'd be happy to work with the results of this study to be able to integrate the things that you have done in the broader, longer range picture that I've come up with Purdue University in over 1,000-page study by spacecraft design study work there that ended in April.
Buzz, I think that might be a good place to end. I think
okay.
a lot of people would be interested in that, but we need to get along to the questions for the press conference. So thank you, Buzz.
Okay.
And let's have some questions from the press. Press first. Yes.
Hose from Defense Daily. Charles, could you explain the national security benefits of having these commercial companies get to the moon beyond just like increased flight rates?
Well, great. I'll talk about that. We talk about that a little bit more in the report. I think the proof is we've already seen the proof of the benefits of commercial partnerships between NASA and commercial industry for space station cargo delivery. We've recaptured leadership in commercial launch, but it's transforming national security launch as well at basically no cost to the DoD. You see SpaceX entering this and creating competition and redundancy in space launch for DoD, and DoD really needs a lower cost, reliable launch. And they're coming in major benefits to national security as well as economic growth. In our scenario, you're going to have lots of flights of commercial launch vehicles that are being used both by DoD and NASA that are being used to take establish this commercially owned and operated lunar base with NASA as a customer. These flight rates, we believe, are going to drive significantly lower launch costs. You're going to see partially reusable launch vehicles come into existence from both the United Launch Alliance with their Vulcan launch vehicle, with the Falcon 9 partially reusable. We don't assume that you could close a fully reusable launch vehicle. We think it's reasonable that you can do a partially reusable like SpaceX and Vulcan are developing and other companies are developing. But we think there's tremendous national security benefits for radically lower launch costs and high flight rates. And also the benefits of robotics in orbit. DARPA is working on a program for satellite servicing in orbit right now. They're also working on the XS-1, much lower launch costs. So these are all things that we would be driving the technologies for robotics, for additive manufacturing, for on-orbit rendezvous and dockings, for repair and maintenance, which would have significant national security benefits. And the DoD, from Stratcom to senior leaders in the Department of Defense, are very concerned about how susceptible we are to attack in space. And so this would have significant resilience benefits to DoD and spin-offs, and using the NASA word, for this partnership.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Tom Risen with U.S. News and World Report. Thank you for this presentation, and thank you to Mr. Aldrin. 46 years ago, landed on the moon. But I think about, when I think about the future of space, I worry about Russia and China. I know they're developing, China's expanding its space program. I think by 2017 they want to get a lunar sample back. They want to send something. Is that right? I think it is. I checked a few weeks ago. But how do we worry about, how do you factor in potential tensions with Russia and China when you think about how we can have a sustained partnership with, it'll be hugely expensive. Even if our companies take the lead, we would still have to worry, we worry about defense contractors from other companies. I mean, other nations don't give them complete access. How would we factor in future tensions to make sure that we can keep the business of space going if we have tensions on Earth?
So do you want to do that, Charles, or Hoyt?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Charles.
Okay.
Well, we're not going to solve all the world's problems. So, what we proposed and looked at in this study is that we would go back to the moon with our closest allies, with free democratic nations that who value basically democratic values and capitalism. And many of those nations are already partners with us in the International Space Station. So you start with free democratic nations who are founded on the principles of capitalism and free people to build a partnership to go to the moon. And you'll see it in the report. We basically say that we think this would be the ultimate shining city on the hill. You would have a lunar base where people were living, there was a permanent lunar base with people on the moon, and everybody across the world could look up and say, America and its Japan, China, not China, Europe, Canada, our closest free democratic partners had a permanent lunar base, and you hold out an olive branch to everybody else on the world to say, the message is when you're a free democracy based on free enterprise, you can join the most exclusive club on or off the planet, and that would be this international partnership.
Jeff?
Jeff Faust, Space News. What's the next step now that this report is done? Is there going to be a follow-on study? What sort of reaction have you gotten from NASA to turn this report into action rather than just yet another series of reports that have been offered over the years on future human exploration?
So, great question, Jeff. So to be fair to NASA, they've been a tremendous supporter of this. They supported this study. They provided lots of feedback during the study, and which we incorporated into the study report. But it's the elected leaders of our nation that decide what's next. There's a decision on, it's the White House and Congress that really need to decide whether this should be incorporated into this. So NASA supported this. They did an economic research. They've asked us to help answer the question, how much would this cost, and is it technically feasible? If the White House and Congress would like NASA to look at taking the next step, I think NASA would be quite responsive. But so it's not, I wouldn't put the burden of this on NASA. NASA is very responsive and supporting in this study. So the real message of this is to the American people. Every time the idea of going back to the moon is brought up, the reaction to the press and the American people, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. We saw this 4 years ago when a candidate for a leading candidate for president proposed this, and the automatic reaction was that they thought this was a $500 billion proposal. So one of the key messages here is we want to kill the idea that it has to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to go back to the moon. That idea should die a quick death. We have think we have definitively answered that if you use a different method, public-private partnerships leveraging American free enterprise, that you could do it radically lower cost. And that's the core message. And the real audience is the American people and their elected leaders. And it's really up to them to decide what to go next. And so we've completed our work for NASA, and there's no commitment beyond that. But we'd be happy to do the next phase if the U.S. government would like that to happen.
Yeah, whatever NASA's, the value of going back to the moon and these other things were yesterday, now looks like 10 times better. Yes?
How long do you think it would take to figure out how much water is on the moon?
Well, NASA's actually partnering with several commercial providers, Astrobotic, Moon Express. I think the answers from them, if they had if you use a COTS-style partnership with one or both of them, competition is good. We did a competition with commercial crew and cargo space station. I'd think having funding both of them, you could rather quickly, probably they would tell you their timelines would be probably in the 3 to 4 years from if they started now. So you could have robots on the moon. They would, I think others would say quicker. I'm a little more conservative, but you could do from the time the money turned on, they probably can do it in 2 years, but it'd take it a little more long to get the money flowing.
Don't forget that when President Kennedy said put a man on the moon, return him safely to Earth, 8 years later we did it. So, putting a robot up there and determining amount of ice is order of magnitude less complex.
Okay, some more questions? Sarah?
Hi, Sarah Fecht from Popular Science. Whenever we post articles about mining in space, we get a lot of reactions like, oh, great, spreading human destruction everywhere. Is there any sort of environmental sustainability built into this plan?
Well, actually, one of the great benefits that we talk about in the study, this will drive significant innovation in technology and environmental technology. We are going to have to close the environmental life support system much more completely than we do everywhere else. So there will be significant investments by NASA and commercial industry in that technology. And so that's part one of the answer. So that there will be great benefits to environmental cleanup technology. Second, the moon is lifeless, and we've proven that. We will be taking life to where there is no life. And so there are no people there. There's no life to damage or destroy. So we'll be, and a big picture message, expanding life into the universe by taking humanity and life itself permanently into the solar system.
In some sense, we'll be greening the moon. Any more questions? Yes.
Clark Lindsay, New Space Global. You mentioned that this would help drive development of reusable space transportation. What about the other way around? I was wondering, say SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others are successful in lowering costs dramatically by 3 or 4. Does that mean the cost of this program would also drastically be reduced? Or does it only affect it 10% or so?
Go ahead.
So we assumed slow, small progress towards reusability. But if SpaceX develops a fully reusable launch vehicle, or Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos, with his fortune, develops a fully reusable, or maybe Paul Allen with Straddle Launch, it changes everything. It gets radically lower and becomes much easier. So, but we didn't assume that. But we would hope that larger markets of transporting propellant and other things to orbit will help them, even incentivize them even more to invest their deep pockets and their great innovation in this area.
Okay, any additional questions? Okay. Does somebody have questions who's not from the press? Okay. Then I thank you for your time, and let's have a big hand for all our speakers and cool videos and whatnot. And that's a wrap. Thanks, everybody.
That space commerce must lag far behind exploration as we move out into the solar system. Rather, commerce is an equal partner to exploration. Commerce must ultimately take the lead for us to incorporate the solar system in our economic sphere, as John Martberger once put it. Commerce, empowered by free enterprise, is key to leading human civilization into space. Only commerce can drive a thriving space economy that will enable and require human settlement. Now and forever, the most valuable thing in space is people. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Charles Miller. He is the principal investigator of the project, and as I said earlier, this will be the meat of what we're talking about. He's also president of NexGen Space LLC. He's executive coordinator of the Alliance for Space Development, which is an alliance between the National Space Foundation and the Space Frontier Foundation for legislative purposes, and also has 10 other organizations involved in it as well. He's co-founder of NanoRacks, which is a corporation which is currently putting experiments on the space station. He's formerly NASA's senior advisor for commercial space. He's also former board member of the National Space Society. Charles?
Thanks, Mark. First,
by video in 2 cases, or they're here in person. After that, we'll have questions. So, let's talk about National Space Society. We are the premier activist grassroots organization which is in supporting the human spaceflight in the world. We were founded by Wernher von Braun in 1974. We have offices in Washington, D.C., although we're an international organization. We have a number of illustrious individuals which have been involved with our organization, one of which is Buzz Aldrin, who is former chair of our board of directors. Of course, he is second man who went to the moon. We also have, as one of our alumni executive directors, George Whitesides, who left us in 2009 to become the chief of staff at NASA. And currently, he is the CEO of Virgin Galactic. And of course, Lori Garver, who was a former executive director of the National Space Society. She was, up until recently, the deputy director of NASA, which is the number 2 position. Currently, she is the general manager at the Airline Pilots Association, which is the big international pilots union, has over 50,000 pilots in it. And with that, I wanted to just make one comment personally about the study. And here's my view. The most important thing is we can reduce the cost of returning to the moon by a factor of 10. That's an order of magnitude. And this really changes everything. And I say that in part because of my background. I'm an economist by training. I have degrees in economics from the California Institute of Technology and also Harvard University. And so when I look at programs, I'm always sort of running mentally in my mind cost-benefit analysis. And if you drop the cost by a factor of 10, from a policy viewpoint, all of a sudden, you've increased the importance, increased the benefits of doing this project by a factor of 10, and that's really big. With that, I'm going to introduce Gary Olson. He is the next speaker. He's a senior aerospace engineer at TASC. He's a board member of the Space Frontier Foundation, which is, well, he'll be up here in a sec, and also former board member of my organization, National Space Society. Gary?
Thank you, Mark. So. Oh, I did it. So I represent the Space Frontier Foundation, an organization of people dedicated to opening the space frontier to human settlement as rapidly as possible. I want to also thank the Heinlein Prize Trust, who helped sponsor this event. This study shows the possibility of dramatic cost reductions for deep space missions. Beyond that, it demonstrates that public-private partnerships can lead to economic growth that is increasingly self-supporting. It challenges any notion we may have.
First, I want to thank the Space Frontier Foundation and the National Space Society for sponsoring this press event of this study that was funded by NASA. So I also want to thank NASA for their financial support for doing all the work we did. We couldn't have done it without them. We put in a proposal last summer, which was in a competitive proposal. There was 5 winners in the Office of Chief Technologist, and we were funded at $100,000. So this is a initial study about the feasibility of returning to the moon. Let's see here. So okay. So top level view. So we basically say the results of this study that with a step-by-step incremental fashion, leveraging commercial partnerships, that you can return to the moon. It's technically feasible. So, and the context of this is NASA's made 3 major attempts to get approval to go back to moon and onto the Mars in the last 45 years since Apollo, and every one of them has basically been turned down by our elected leaders, both Congress and the White House. And they failed because the minimum cost was $100 billion, and the price grew from there to many hundreds of billions to, in one case, almost $1 trillion. And it was just a non-starter. So the base of this study was leveraging the now lessons learned from COTS and Commercial Crew. Could you go back to the moon? Is it technically feasible? And what would it cost? That's the core questions of this study.
Okay. I'm here today for a press conference, which is being presented by a combination of the National Space Society and the Space Frontier Foundation. Our 2 organizations are working together to present this press conference because of the importance of the topic at hand. And this concerns what I've got up here, which is a short version of the title of the study, Evolvable Lunar Architecture Study. I'm Mark Hopkins. I'm the moderator for this event, and I'm also the CEO of the National Space Society. This here gives the plan for today. At the top, we have the actual full title for the report. It's the Economic Assessment and Systems Analysis of an Evolvable Lunar Architecture that leverages commercial space capabilities and public-private partnerships. You can see why I had a short version on the first slide. And here's the people that will be speaking. In a minute, will say something about the National Space Society. And then the next speaker will be Gary Olson, and he's on the board of the Space Frontier Foundation, and he'll say something about that organization. And then we'll have the person who did most of the work, the principal investigator, Charles Miller. He'll come up and talk about the meat of the subject. And he's also president of NexGen Space, LLC, which is the company which did the project. And then we will have 4 additional people who will make comments, and they're quite an illustrious group, concerning the study, either